Good morning. If everybody can take their seats. We are live from Louisville, Kentucky at Symposium for Bourbon Women. So excited, so excited. I am reading a lot of notes because we've been drinking for several days. So I normally would, I would normally not read so much. And Dave, please forgive me. You and I'll buy you a drink when you come to Colorado. I am Nancy Roberts. I am the Bourbon Ambassador for the state of Colorado. I'm filling in this morning. So we are a prospective branch and we're getting rolling in Colorado. Come see us. Yeah. So we are here in Louisville and we are online live to Spirits Network, which is, if you don't know Spirits Network, again, I gotta have to read a little bit. First video commerce platform that combines programming with the ability to shop with a click. So clearly we need to check that out if you don't know who they are. On live here is Dave Broom. He's a Glaswegian. Did I get that right, Dave?
Yep.
I know who Dave is, and I kind of had a moment where I panicked that I was having to introduce him because I don't know him personally, but I know of him, I should say. And again, I'm gonna have to read. If you haven't read many of his books, but one of the ones I've had for a while is The World Atlas of Whiskey, which is just brilliant. He's also written The Way of Whiskey, The Journey into Japanese Whiskey, awarded the John Avery Prize for Andre Simon Awards in 2018. Prior to that, Whiskey the Manual was awarded Best Spirits Book at the Spirited Awards in 2015. World Atlas of Whiskey, I just mentioned, it's been called a landmark publication. So I don't know very much about Scotch other than I love it. And Dave's going to make sure that we all learn more this morning. So I'm going to turn it over to him and let him educate us all. So thank you, Dave.
Thank you. I'm really sorry I can't be with you and I can't see you. I don't even know if I can. I don't even know if I can hear you. But if you could all shout at this point, maybe I can pick you up on the mic. There we go. I just saw a quick video of Peggy. Hey, hello. That's better. The real people. It's good. It's kind of weird just talking to yourself. I mean, I do it all the time, but it's kind of weird on this. I would love to have twerked down the aisle like Peggy, but hey, you know, you've got me over here in the UK. And I must say, I'm incredibly impressed by the fact that there's a room full of people sitting down to drink whiskey at 11:30. Pardon me, 11:30 in the morning. Well done. It's 4:30 here. And I didn't mean to do that. Anyway, what I would like to talk about over the next 50 minutes or so is about Scotch whisky. And we'll touch on production, we'll touch on history certainly, but we're really going to kind of concentrate on flavor because that's the best way to understand any spirit. It doesn't matter which one it is. You know, let's just drill down into flavor, what the flavors are, where they come from, and take the story and spin the story from there. But if there's one kind of theme, and you probably see it on your wonderful tasting mats, it's all these kind of myths that have built up around Scotch whisky over the past, I don't know, about 100 years. And because they've built up over about 100 years, they have been quite hard to break down to get people to actually understand the reality of Scotch and what Scotch whisky is all about. This, for me, is really a great chance to start showing the diversity of Scotch whisky, the different ways in which it's made, and also the different ways in which you can enjoy it. I hope you enjoy all of the whiskies. If you find a flavor you don't particularly enjoy, that's okay, really. You know, I don't think any of us anywhere around the world will like every single glass that's put in front of us. So, and the thing about Scotch whisky is it has got such a vast array of different styles and different flavors. You will find some that you prefer over others. That really is not a problem. I'm not trying to convert you into drinking nothing but Scotch, just to expand that knowledge and understand that here is a kissing cousin of bourbon. So I'm going to be talking about distilleries. I'm going to be talking, as I said, a little bit about production. But really, I think the best way to kick off, rather than me just kind of rambling on, because you must be really, really thirsty by now, is kind of kicking off with our first whiskey. Now, I do believe that and this is going to get quite complicated when you're 5 whiskies in, so please do pay attention to me at this point. We're going to be jumping around in terms of that tasting map you've got in front of you. So the first whiskey that we're going to be having is the one that's marked Scotch is for after dinner. And this is the first myth that I would like to puncture. You know, that Scotch, well, what is Scotch? And you think of all the cliched images of Scotch whiskey. You think of it in movies, you know, you think of it in advertising. It is men, and we'll come on to that later, sitting down in a kind of darkened, low-lit cigar lounge after dinner with a big, thick tumbler and sipping away about Scotch and probably plotting something nasty. Scotch whiskey kind of become the signifier for nastiness and evil doing over the years. I'm trying to redress that balance immediately. You know, but this idea, you know, Scotch is really only there for the digestif. It's only there for something after dinner with your cigar when you're kind of sitting down and relaxing. Scotch plays in that camp. Scotch plays in that camp brilliantly. Bourbon plays in that camp brilliantly as well. Scotch isn't just an after dinner drink. It's not just a heavy spirit. It can be light. In fact, I would say the vast majority of Scotch whiskies are in fact quite light. Scotch can be smoky, but it doesn't have to be smoky. That's again something that we're going to be touching on later on. So it can be an aperitif as well as a digestif. So the first whiskey to kind of show that Scotch is not just for after dinner is Altmore. Altmore, 12 years old. I'll try and find the bottle. I'll fall off my chair. Altmore, 12 years old. There we are, widely available. It's at 46%, which if you double it gives you proof. I'm really bad at maths, so I'm afraid you're going to have to do that yourselves. But anyway, the thing about Altmore is that it's not that well known as a single malt. And there's this other kind of peculiar thinking about Scotch whiskey that you'll have heard of the famous single malt brands. You'll have heard of Macallan or Lagavulin or Bowmore or, you know, the big brands, Glenfiddich, you know, classic example of that. Glenlivet, I won't keep going on. But, you know, you've heard of all these kind of big names that you see, ubiquitous single malt brands. But there's 140 distilleries operational in Scotland at the moment, which isn't bad when you think there's only 5 million people. You know, we're thirsty folk. And there's this kind of assumption that's built up that if a whiskey is not well known as a single malt, it's in some way inferior. And I want to address this idea of blends as we move through. It's just there for blending. Therefore, the whiskey isn't quite as good. I've even been around distilleries where people who know whiskey, who enjoy whiskey, have asked the distiller, so at what time of year do you make the whiskey that goes into single malt? You know, as if there was a time of year where you make the good stuff for single malt, and the rest of the time it's just for blends. Not true. In fact, I like to turn this on its head. That the reason why you haven't maybe heard of a distillery such as Altmore is because blenders love it. And why do blenders love it? Because it's actually really good whiskey, because it performs a fantastic function in a blend, but is also brilliant on its own. So let's have a little look at this poor, forgotten, flogged workhorse of a whiskey, which is coming from the Speyside region of Scotland. I'm not going to go into too much details on regions. I don't really believe in them. But anyway, let's have a little look at this. And think in terms of, is this a before dinner drink or an after dinner drink? It's light, it's fresh, it's quite acidic. You've got that wonderful kind of pear note coming through. A real kind of brightness, kind of green apple elements. Not a huge amount of wood coming through on this. This is really one of these big kind of distillery forward whiskies. And you think, well, because it's got this freshness, you know, in terms of wine, this is, I don't know what, that Riesling or a Sauvignon Blanc, you know, it's got that kind of green character coming in there. Estery, you know, the technical term is estery, you know, those kind of fresh green fruits coming through. Take a little taste of it. And the thing I love about Altmore, and the thing that I think is always really, really important when you're tasting any spirit, is on that first sip, you'll have done the nosing, you'll have worked out what these aromas are. What you're doing when you're tasting it is kind of confirming what your nose has already told you. You've got the actual tastes themselves. Is it sweet or is it sour? Is it bitter, etc., etc.? But the really important thing in terms of this kind of sensory way of appreciating a spirit, appreciating a Scotch whisky in this case, is texture. What does it feel like? Because I can start talking to you about what I'm getting from the glass, but what I'm getting from the glass, although you will probably be getting the same aromas, the words that you will use to talk about those aromas will be different. I'm from Glasgow, you know. Those of you who have been to Glasgow or been to Scotland know that, you know, that the Scottish diet consists of fried food and cakes, you know. So that's the way that I've been brought up. You know, I'm very good at picking up fried food and cakes. But depending on where you are around the world, the aromas will appear in different ways because that's your frame of reference. But the texture and the feel of the whiskey will be pretty much the same for everyone. So it's a really good way to start thinking about assessing flavor, especially when you're talking about it. So let's take another little sip. And you would think from the nose that it's going to be really sharp and really acidic and really kind of, it's got a real bite to it. But it's the complete opposite. I think when you take it in the mouth, it's got this wonderful, really kind of sensual, silky character right in the middle. Maybe just a tiny little touch of American oak coming in there, a little kind of creaminess coming in. But that is, to be perfectly honest, is as much coming from the distillate itself rather than just from the wood. It's just got this wonderful, wonderful mouthfeel. So you could see how this works as a single malt. You could also see how it would work so well in a blend, for it's giving top notes to a blend, but it's also adding to that mouthfeel. For me, how would I drink it? I probably wouldn't drink it like this. I would put this bottle in the fridge. I would put the bottle in the fridge. I would have friends coming around. I do actually have some friends, and we are now actually allowed to visit each other. And if I had friends who said they didn't like whiskey, I would have that bottle of Altmore sitting there in the fridge. I'd take it out, I'd pour it into a wine glass or a champagne flute, have it nice and cold, give it to them, and they would sip it and go, what is this? Because you think it's almost like a wine. And I go, it's whiskey. And they go, I don't like whiskey. And I'll say, you do now. Yeah, that's the way to do it. You know, you find these unbelievers, get around them in various ways. But it's quite important, you know, this idea that you can lengthen, you can change temperature, you can change glassware, you can alter that flavor and alter that delivery of flavor in so many different ways, because whiskey is an incredibly versatile spirit. So I would probably either lengthen this or have it nice and chilled. So hopefully, I don't know. Do you like this one? Shout if you like it. All I got was a deafening silence. That's seriously worrying. I hope you liked it. Thumbs up. Oh yeah, cool. Excellent. I can see you now. That's good. All I can see is my big red sweaty face. I can see you up in the corner. You liked it. Good. Excellent. Phew. Done. Whiskey number one done. So remember that Altmore. And remember that fact that, you know, Scotch whiskey, it can appeal to people in so many different ways. I've just done a bar up in right in the kind of geographical heart of Scotland, right next to Balmoral Castle. And what we've done there is we've got 365 whiskies in a really small room and divided them all not by region but by flavour. So we've got fragrant ones, fruity ones, we've got rich ones, we've got smoky ones. And it's the perfect way to kind of get people to relax into whiskey. That if they're not used to drinking whiskey, you act like a bartender, and you can do this with your friends. You know, well, what do you normally drink? You know, if you drink red wine, well, I can push you this way because you've got those big dark fruit characters coming through. Or you like white wine, well, you can go in this direction because you've got this kind of freshness and vibrancy. So just talking about flavour is for me, I think the first step in the journey, especially with Scotch whiskey, because of its diversity of flavour, and also because if you begin talking about regions in terms of Scotch, you're on hiding to nothing because every region makes every style of whiskey. So, you might as well talk about individual distilleries. So anyway, I'm glad that met with your approval. Sorry, I'm trying not to loom. I realize that this is liable to look a bit like 1984. You know, I'm kind of looming towards you and kind of break whiskey, drink Scotch whiskey. So I'm trying to sit back and relax and not get pecked in the ear by a curlew. Okay, so let's move on to our next myth about Scotch. And the second one is a really, really important one. It's one that gets me really quite irritated, and you don't want to get a Glaswegian irritated. And it's this one, that Scotch has to be old. So have a look for that one on your tasting mat, that Scotch has to be old. Where would I even start with this one? The problem came when age statements began to be put on bottles of Scotch whisky. Age conferred seriousness to Scotch. It suddenly became, well, it's got an age statement, therefore it is of higher quality. And it's a very easy extrapolation to make from it has a number on the bottle to, well, the higher the number, the better the quality, because the longer time it's spent in wood, the better that whiskey is going to be. And that simply isn't true. But that has changed, and that has grown, and that kind of myth has developed and kind of adhered to this idea of what Scotch is, or indeed what it isn't in reality, really with the rise of single malt. I mean, when I first began writing about whiskey, which was a long time ago, 30 years ago, a 12-year-old whiskey was called a deluxe whiskey. It was called a deluxe whiskey because it was really quite an unusually old age for a whiskey to be. 12 years. Wow, you know, that's when you're moving into a very esoteric area. You know, this year I think there's going to be 80-year-old whiskies getting launched. It's easy to find 17-year-old, 20-year-old, 25-year-old, etc., etc. And there is this idea, therefore, that the older that whiskey is, that the better it is. The age somehow confers quality into a Scotch whiskey. And that's not true. That's not true. It's important that you can kind of bring this down, and this will apply to, I would say, any whiskey. The age is just a number. It's the number of years that spirit has spent in cask. It's just a number. Maturity, however, is a character. Age is a number, maturity is a character. And it's the character that you're wanting. And why is that important? And why can you play around with this one? Because I have to thank you in general, you know, in America, you know, especially there in Kentucky and Tennessee, for your wonderfully profligate way with wood. You know, gosh, we've used it once, get rid of it. You know, it's useless now. We are very mean people in Scotland. You know, we like things that are cheap and secondhand. We'll take as much secondhand wood as you want to send our way, because it suits our whiskey. It suits our whiskey style. So there's less coming in from the wood the first time that you're going to be filling it with Scotch whiskey. And because we're mean, we're going to empty that whiskey out, and we're going to put more new make back in. We're going to fill it a second time, and maybe a third time, depending on the length of the fill. And so when you think about that, and you think of the flavour that's left in the wood, by the time you fill that for a third time, there's actually less flavour in the wood to come into the whiskey. However, it could be sitting in that cask for 20 years. It's a 20-year-old whiskey, but it's not necessarily a fully mature whiskey, because the wood will be quite tired. That's what I mean by age is a number, maturity is a character. Every whiskey has its own arc of maturity. It starts off quite raw, it begins to mature, all that aggression has gone, and slowly but surely will begin to pick up wood characters, and then it'll move to kind of peak where everything is in absolute equilibrium, but interesting stuff before that. And then eventually it'll move right over, and the wood will take over, and it'll become too bitter, too astringent. And it might be old, but it's actually not necessarily a very nice drink. So what I want to do with the second whiskey is give you a really young one. And this is from Bruichladdich. So this is from the island of Islay, which is 100 miles due west of Glasgow. Once you leave the west coast of Islay, the next landfall is Nova Scotia. So it gets a lot of weather. out there, relatively remote. This is made from Islay barley, barley grown on 7 farms on Islay. And it's a 6-year-old whiskey. Scotch has to be 3 years old before it can even be called Scotch whiskey. So this is a very, very young one. But you smell it. And it's a really interesting one, this for me. This is, and it's actually a distiller, Adam Hannett, describes it as the whiskey right at the changing point. You know, just where that distillery character is full, and it's just beginning to move over into kind of more kind of wood-led balance and complexity. So you've got that barley character coming through. You've got the kind of fresh barley coming in. Kind of, again, that kind of green fruit note that you got from the Altmore. There's a tiny little touch of coconut just coming in there. That's coming from American oak, ex-bourbon barrels coming in there. But freshness, lots of kind of grapefruit character, but much more of that kind of cereal, ground cereal, oats, porridge. You might not even know what porridge is. We have it with salt in Scotland. I often, when I smell cereal, I smell a kind of like very clean hamster cage. I don't know if that helps. Probably not. And take a little taste of it. That vanilla character is there, but a lovely kind of fresh fruit. Kind of apricots, a bit stronger as well. 50%. You might want to add a little drop of water to it. It's got lovely length to it. A little kind of floral thing just coming through in the end, and that's very, very typical of Bruichladdich. And this is a really important thing to remember about Scotch whisky and about single malt whisky in particular. That those 3 words, single malt whisky. Okay, so it's whisky, therefore it has to conform to Scotch whisky regulations. Okay, we might touch on that in a wee while. Malt, it has to be made from 100% malted barley and water and yeast. Boom, that's it. Nothing else added. No enzymes. We don't have enzymes. Single is the word that tends to be forgotten. But single is actually, for me, the most important word in those 3. Because single means it can only come from that one distillery. That one spot on the earth, that the only one that will produce these specific flavors. Single malt is talking about individuality. It's talking about singularity, if you like to put it that way. And that individuality, which is a distillery character, will be different for every one of the 140 distilleries, single malt distilleries operational in Scotland. And this is a classic example of Bruichladdich distillery character. That little bit of cereal, that sweet fruit, that floral character coming through. Distillery character, absolutely paramount at this stage. And that, for me, is what's so really exciting about younger whiskies. They shouldn't be aggressive. There has to be a little bit of wood, a little bit of that kind of softening vanilla character coming in, just kind of rounding things off. But that distillery character is coming through. It's saying, I am Bruichladdich. You know, this is what I am about. This one whiskey, you could bottle it in 10 years' time. It would still be Bruichladdich, but the character would have changed. It will have mellowed, it will have softened, the fruits will have come through, the wood will perhaps be a little bit more obvious as it's older. But I think it's really, really important to appreciate younger whiskies. And the other thing about younger whiskies, because you are beginning to see them coming out on the market more, is that wood management has improved immensely in Scotland over the past, I don't know, 20 odd years. I mean, when I was starting out, you know, if it came from a tree, they'd use it. You know, these days, you know, the trees are essentially hand-picked. You know, every distiller knows, you know, if not what forest and what cooper he's going to be using, what bourbon distiller they want to be buying the cask from. So there's a real input of higher quality wood. And because of higher quality wood coming in, it's actually meaning that younger whiskies are allowed to be made because you've got that little bit more of the wood elegance beginning to come in to soften those perhaps rougher edges off. So what do we think of that? Do we like that one? Yeah, well, there's clapping. That's good. That's a good thing. It's an absolutely fascinating whiskey, this, because it's from Islay, you know, and those of you who do know Scotch whiskey, and you know, I would love to be there so I could say, you know, who's been to Scotland, etc., etc. Those who do know Scotch whisky, you'll have heard of Islay. And Islay's famous for smoky whiskies. This is a whiskey from Islay. It's not smoky. There's no smoke in it at all. You don't have to make smoky whiskey in Islay. It's a really, really good example. And the fact that Bruichladdich are now working with 17 different farms in Islay. There was no barley grown in Islay 20 years ago. There's now 17 farms growing barley for distilleries in Islay. And that's brilliant. It's brilliant for the community. It's brilliant for the farming. It's great for sustainability. It's great for green credentials and everything. So it just makes sense. So there's a whole number of reasons for this whiskey being a cracker. And I'm really, really glad that you enjoyed it. So this idea of Scotch has to be old. No. Scotch is for after dinner. No. Myths gone. Cast to the four winds as we move on to our next dram. And our next dram is in that section which is Scotch is for men of a certain age. Yeah, exactly. Scotch is for men of a certain age who have grey beards and grey hair, and they sit and they mutter and they talk about phenolic parts per million, and they wear tweed, and they don't really let you in. And it's certainly good grief. A woman's drink? Don't be ridiculous. Far too strong for a woman. How often have you heard that? It's disgraceful. It is wrong. It has always been wrong. And the great thing that has happened in recent years, again, probably over the last 2 decades, as I've been traveling around the world, is the way that whiskey has kind of shed this and really begun to shed this. And, younger women and women drinking whiskey because it is just a great drink, and why the hell shouldn't women enjoy it? So what I'd like to talk about with this one, and the reason for picking this particular whiskey, is actually then kind of talking kind of wider terms. So not just whiskey will appeal to anyone. It doesn't matter, what sex you are, what religion you are, what, sexual proclivities you have, etc. It really doesn't matter. But women within whiskey is actually a very interesting area. So this whiskey is Cardu. So it's Cardu, 12 years old. So Cardu is another of these Speyside distilleries. And Cardu was established at the beginning of the 19th century by Helen Cumming. So it was owned by women. Well, the farm, the tack, was owned by her husband because she can own property, but she was the distiller. And her daughter, Elizabeth, took over from her as distiller. And myself and a friend, Arthur Motley, we have this this kind of bizarre kind of YouTube channel called The Liquid Antiquarian, where we look at, again, kind of questioning a lot of the history and a lot of the assumptions in history in Scotch whisky. And one of them was the role of women in whisky. And we discovered that actually the first businesses which were owned by women in Scotland at the beginning of the 19th century were distilleries. There weren't that many, but at a time when no women were owning businesses, there were women owning distilleries. So Little Mill was one, and Cardu was another. And Helen Cumming, the Cardu is located really quite high up on Speyside, overlooking Glenlivet lying to the south of Speyside. This is a big area for illicit distillation, for moonshining, the tail end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. And because Cardu was on a farm, and quite a high farm, there's a good lookout point. So from the people in Glenlivet, the illicit distillers in Glenlivet, looking back towards Cardu, and Cardu looking down the glen to see if the excise men, if the gaugers were on their way. And what would happen is, if the gaugers did come to Cardu, Helen would invite them in for a wee cup of tea. Come on inside, have a wee cup of tea and some shortbread and maybe some soup. Oh, the weather's dreadful, isn't it? Elizabeth, however, would race round the back and hoist up this red flag, and this red flag would be fluttering above Cardu, and everybody further down the glen in Glenlivet would go, the gaugers are coming, and hide all the illicit distilling equipment. So really, really important. And Elizabeth Cumming owned this distillery right up until the tail end of the 19th century, when the distillery was closed. It was sold to John Walker. But the Cummings still were involved all the way through. So really important. And just the kind of final point about it is that this was not unusual. You're right up until the beginning of this illicit distillation trade, women would have been the distillers, especially in the Highlands, because it was a domestic activity. The men would have been out in the fields, or the men would have been out fishing or whatever, and brewing and distilling were domestic duties. So women would have been distillers from from hundreds of years before that, all the way back to wise women making potions and making medicines. And it's only when illicit distillation came in because of change of law, it suddenly became dangerous and it moved away from the house. Therefore, men actually began to become distillers. So the role of women in Scotch whisky has been completely ignored, and damn well should be written about a hell of a lot more. The great news is within the whisky industry at the moment, I would say, given there's so many women who are distillery managers or distillers, distillery operators, every company making blends will have at least one women blending. The blending team at Macallan, the whiskey making team at Macallan is all women. So it is happening within the industry. What we all have to do within the Scotch whisky industry is to start calling out and actively calling out mainly the men who turn up to whisky shows, insulting brand ambassadors, female brand ambassadors, and women standing behind the stands because they think that they don't know anything about whisky. Those are the guys that we've really got to call out. Damn it! But it will happen, and it is changing. Anyway, we have a dram in front of us. Cardu, again, delicious, light, kind of medium-bodied. This is a 12-year-old, light, kind of medium-bodied character with Cardu. It's quite citric. It's got this lovely kind of grassy, kind of green grassy character. I hope you kind of get that. It's also some chocolate, some orange and chocolate. It's a very, very clear signature for Cardu for me. You're noticing again a little bit older. The wood is a little bit richer coming in. Again, American oak, get that lovely kind of spicy note beginning to come in. Interesting to compare that back to the other two where the wood was lighter in character coming through. Makes a really good highball. It works really brilliantly with ginger ale in particular. Taste.
Cheers.
Gentle, easygoing, and you know what? I love it for that. I love it. The fact it's a delicious, easygoing breakfast whiskey. Because essentially that's what you're drinking over there, or maybe a brunch whiskey. The finish isn't incredibly long. There's some complexity. The balance is beautiful. It's just a hugely approachable whiskey. But that backstory for me is what really sets Cardu apart, and that's why Cardu really, for me, should be an absolute flagship of what whiskey should be about. What do you think of that then? Well, there's clapping going on still. That's good. You're either all very polite or you're enjoying it. So that's good. And I'm sure you're all just enjoying it because you'll be polite as well. So we've got this. It's not just for men of a certain age. It doesn't have to be old. It can be drunk at any time of the day. So what's the next one that we're going to be looking at? The next one, have a look on your tasting mat for all Scotch is smoky. Now, this is a really interesting one for me. And I think we've already had 3 drams and there hasn't been a whisper of smoke in it. So I think we've kind of proved this point already. But I wanted to show that this whiskey in particular and kind of begin to shift the discussion off into a slightly different direction here. And I'm intrigued why this kind of smoky thing came up. And it's something which I have noticed in America more than anywhere else. And a lot of, and especially among bartenders, and a lot of it comes from the bar books and the bar manuals that were written in kind of 1930s, after Prohibition, obviously, 1930s into the 1950s, where it was decreed by people like Charles H. Baker, David Embury, amazing writers, great, wonderful cocktail books. But they were pretty dismissive about Scotch. Scotch is a grumpy old bachelor who should only be mixed with soda, wrote Embry, kind of dismissing it out of hand. Bourbon, on the other hand, brilliant for making cocktails. And one of the reasons that it's always been given in those bar manuals is that all Scotch is smoky. Therefore, you can't make it into a drink, which I don't quite understand to begin with, but it's not all smoky. In fact, very little Scotch is smoky. Very few blends these days are smoky, and actually very, very few of those 140 single malt distilleries operational in Scotland at this particular moment are necessarily making smoky whiskey. So it's a very kind of specialized area. And I thought, well, how do I show that not all Scotch is smoky? Well, I think, well, actually, why not actually then also show a style of whiskey which you might not have come across? Because in Scotland, we don't just make single malt whiskey. We also make grain whiskey. We make single grain whiskey. And this next dram is Hedonism, or perhaps Hedonism, as you know, it can be pronounced, by a blending company called Compass Box, who are based in London and run by an American guy called John Glazer, really dear friend of mine. John was pretty high up in the world of Johnny Walker, and then had, he's still a young man, a relatively early midlife crisis, and kind of went, no, the big corporate life is not for me. I want to go off and make whiskey in my own way and actually address some of these issues that we've been talking about. And the first whiskey that he brought out is this bottling, well, not this particular bottling, but this brand called Hedonism. Pick up the glass. Maybe go back to one of the other whiskies. Go back to the Altmore. This is always good when you're tasting. Never just drink one glass of whiskey. Always have two. Compare and contrast. And if anybody looks at you in a kind of weird way, just go, hey, I'm working. I'm a professional. You know? Because only by comparing one against the other do the secrets really come out. You know, you're flying blind if you've only got one glass in front of you. This is substantially different, isn't it? You know, it's much softer. You've got more of that kind of maple syrup coming through, creme brulee, lots more kind of gentle vanilla. You've got this kind of sweet, almost like fat character coming in as well. My God, can I smell a little bit of corn coming in? Yes, you can, because this is grain whiskey. So this is a grain whiskey coming from two distilleries, one called North British, which is in Edinburgh, and one called Cameron Bridge, which is kind of opposite Edinburgh, across the Firth of Forth. And they make grain whiskey. So what is grain whiskey? We'll come back to the whiskey. Sip away at it. It's stunning. It's gorgeous. It's sexy whiskey. What's grain whiskey? Well, grain whiskey is distilled in a different way. It's a mixed mash bill. Because we can't use enzymes, we have to use malted barley to convert starch into sugar. So for grain whiskey, which is either made from wheat, predominantly these days from wheat, or from corn, which North British uses, corn or maize, depending on what term you prefer to use, mixed together with a little bit of malted barley to convert the starches into sugar, and then fermented and then distilled in a column still, distilled to a very high strength. So distilled to 94.8. Can't be any higher than 94.8, otherwise it's considered neutral and then can't be classed as whiskey. So the character is a lot lighter in flavor, higher in strength, much more kind of lifted, more aromatic, lighter in body as well. And one trick and one technique that a lot of distillers will use is take this lighter character whiskey and put it into casks, into barrels, which have come fresh from America. And it's a really good way of seasoning those casks with Scotch whiskey, and also getting a big impact of wood into that lighter style of whiskey. So you will find that the majority of grain whiskies will have a bit more of that kind of wood character coming through. Hence that vanilla element coming in. At times, and not with this one, but other grain whiskies, you could swear you were actually drinking rum. It's kind of in that kind of interesting area. I remember doing that once actually at a rum tasting, talking about the relationship between Scotch and rum in Scotland and the Caribbean, which is another very interesting, slightly worrying connection. And giving this bunch of rum distillers from the Caribbean a grain whiskey from Glasgow, and it was almost a fight because they kept insisting it was rum. And I'm going, it's not, it's from Glasgow. Honestly, it's whiskey, you know. But anyway, with hedonism on the palate, I think maybe perhaps you can even get some of that rummy element coming through. It's got a wonderful kind of banana, mashed up banana, that lovely kind of maple syrup element coming in, touch of gingerbread, some lovely spices coming in at the end, kind of nutmeg, a little bit of cinnamon. The texture is fantastic. And that's the really, really important thing about grain whiskey. And especially important when we move on to our next whiskey, which is that mouthfeel, that really kind of sensual, almost kind of oily character, which is surprising for a whiskey that light, but all grain whiskey has it. The other thing that people forget about grain whiskey, mainly because the whiskey industry hasn't been very good at explaining what grain whiskey is about, is that every grain distillery has its own distillery character. So North British, which is used here, is actually quite a heavy, quite a rich style, and it uses maize, uses corn, so it's got that fatness coming through. Girvan, owned by William Grant, much more floral in character. Cameron Bridge is much more kind of in that kind of slightly more limey, lemony, citric character coming through. And what a blender will do is actually blend together different grains, because they all have different characters, with those single malts to make something fantastic. I just think this is an utterly delicious whiskey. You could put this in the freezer, you know, put this in the freezer and pour it over ice cream, or drink it frozen and have it with chocolate cake. You know, it's just, oh, amazing, amazing, amazing. And this was a revelation for people, because people hadn't really tried grain whiskey when this first appeared, which would be 20 years ago. And it was just kind of, oh my God, where have you been all my life? A really, really important whiskey in the history of modern Scotch whiskies. I think a stunner. What do you think, ladies? Oh, I think we have a hit here. But you know, there are interesting parallels here. You know, if you've been drinking, I don't know, if you've been drinking something like Crown Royal, or drinking some, you know, some lighter American whiskies, you know, you can see that they're in a kind of similar camp. You know, it's touching on that Canadian style. I know I'm a huge fan of Canadian whiskey, but yeah, gorgeous stuff, and it's not smoky. So there we are. Not all Scotch is smoky. So where do we move to now? Well, the next one, and you'll probably be able to work out if you should only probably have 2 glasses left. Blends are inferior to single malt. You know, this in itself is a day's debate. All right, don't be worried. It's not. We're going to crack through it quite quickly. Blended whiskey is really important for Scotch whiskey. Scotch whiskey has had the dominant position in terms of the world, in terms of whiskey sales, for pretty much 100 years. Thanks to Prohibition, knocking the American industry out. Thanks to Irish independence, knocking the Irish industry out. Thanks to the Canadian industry essentially filling the pipeline to satisfy American customers. And Scotch had the rest of the world. That's essentially, you know, what's happened. And it was built by blended whiskey. And even today, you know, I know we talk a huge amount about single malt whiskey. Even today, you know, still what, 88% of the whiskey sold around the world is blended Scotch. And you kind of pause for a second, you think, well, 88%, you know, okay, that's probably quite a lot. Yeah, it is quite a lot. Johnnie Walker sells 19 million cases, blended whiskey. They must be doing something right. you know, there must be something inherently good about blends. Otherwise, there's plenty of choice out there. People wouldn't necessarily automatically try it. So blends are not inferior to single malt. In fact, you know, I was speaking to Jim Beveridge, who is the master blender at Johnnie Walker the other week. And he was saying, as he's often said in the past, you know, the best thing you can do with a single malt is put a great grain with it. And the best thing you can do with a great grain is put great single malt with it. You know, blends make sense. We as people, we blend. You know, we live in a world of blend. You know, if you go out for something to eat, you're blending different flavors on that plate. If you're drinking a cocktail, you're blending. You know, if you're wearing perfume, that's a blend. If you enjoy a cigar, that's a blend as well. You know, we are inherently attuned to blending as a species. So it bemuses me that when people kind of get on the Scotch bandwagon and you know, and join the club, as it were, they immediately begin to look down on blends and see them as less good. Because if you've got all these single malts and they're all magnificent and you put them together, then why is that diminishing it? And if you've got great grains, as we've just seen, grain whiskey is great, and you add that, then why shouldn't the result be actually a more complex, greater than the sum of its parts? So the one I wanted to show you today is Ballantine's 17-year-old. And I chose it because I love it. I just think it's a fantastic, fantastic blend. Master blender there is a guy called Sandy Hislop. He's been there for a long time. He knows what he's doing. And the Ballantine style, it's interesting when you kind of divide Scotland up in terms of blend style. Johnny Walker, for example, originated in Kilmarnock. Kilmarnock is on the west coast of Scotland. The west coast of Scotland is near to Campbelltown and near to Islay. And they traditionally made quite heavy styled whiskies. And Johnny Walker was a fairly heavy styled whiskey, more smoke coming through on Walker. Teachers as well, which is a Glasgow blend, tended to be slightly heavier, slightly richer. Same with White and Mackay. So maybe it was a Glasgow palate, maybe it's proximity to that particular part of Scotland, maybe it's a combination of the both. But if you looked at the styles of whiskies getting made, blends getting made in Aberdeen, different again, much lighter in character, and also in general terms, lighter in character coming from Edinburgh as well. I'm from Glasgow, obviously the best city in Scotland. Edinburgh, it might as well be in England. But the Edinburgh style was always this slightly more floral, slightly lighter style, and that has continued all the way from the late 19th century right up until today. So this has the Ballantine's signature to it. So we've had elements of wood, we've had elements of different distilleries coming through, we've had the quality of grain being shown as well. So let's just put them all together and make something which is greater than the sum of its parts. Because a blender can play with different types of oak. Doesn't have to use first fill. It can use first fill or a refill. First fill, I mean first time it's filled Scotch whiskey. Could be American oak, could be ex-sherry casks, or it could be a combination of both. Or it could be first fill and refill from both of them. All of a sudden, boom, 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 boom. All these different possibilities begin to open up. It doesn't have to be 17-year-old. The youngest whiskey in here is 17 years old. There could be stuff significantly older. It could be woodier, or it could be fruitier. Because remember, age isn't a number, it's a character and maturity. I think what you get here, you got a lovely, again, kind of peachy apricot character. You can see that element of maturity coming through. When I smell whiskies like this, I think of, well, Agatha Christie murder mysteries, when she's always in like a country house with highly polished tables and floors. So you get that kind of slight kind of furniture polish coming through, and kind of waxiness coming in. But, if you were to add a little drop of water to this, that very classical Ballantine's mix of flowers and fruit and apples especially begins to come through. I think it's just fantastically complex drink. And again, something that Jim was saying in that chat that I had with him the other week, he was saying one of the big problems with blended Scotch whiskey is that we put it on the front label. If we just had Johnny Walker Scotch whiskey, and then on the back label said, this is a blend and this is what we do, or Lagavulin Scotch whiskey, maybe the problem that people have is just in that word blend. Let's just take it off the label. It's going to be an interesting debate. But I think this is utterly delicious. For me, you could lengthen this. It works quite well with green tea, with kind of sweetened Korean or Chinese green tea. Good with ginger ale. But for me, this is one to have maybe before dinner, maybe in the afternoon, with a nice big proper ice ball, cube of ice. Don't dilute it too much. Just a great dram. Blends are good. What do we think of this one? Oh, yes. Excellent. I'm delighted. I'm delighted that you've enjoyed. You appear to have enjoyed how many? 1, 2, 3. You've enjoyed five whiskies. I'm now about to ruin absolutely everything by getting you to commit sacrilege. And it's at this point that perhaps me being a few thousand miles away ain't necessarily a particularly bad thing. Because, you know, the last thing that I'm going to be doing here is telling you to take. You've got some cola there. Scotch cannot or should not be mixed. I have here a bottle of Lagavulin. Lagavulin, as you know, if you watch Parks and Recs, you know, an amazing whiskey from Islay. The most complex, for me, the most complex smoky whiskey on Islay. So this is smoky, folks. You know, we finally got to our smoky gram. Revered around the world. You know, this is a whiskey that thou shalt not touch. Just sit and sip and savor. So I'm going to pour myself. This is all chilled. We dram of that. And then you should all have little cans of cola next to you. Chilled cola. No! Don't do it! Never buy one of your bloody books, Broom. You've ruined it. Okay, right. Don't add the cola. Take a little sip of the Lagavulin first. Just a sip. I know. Wonderful. Rich. Lapsang Souchong tea. A little bit of saltiness coming through. Richness, dark fruits. The smoke is there. It's just like sitting next to a beach bonfire as it's just beginning to go down. Now, add the same amount of cola. Oh, yeah. Sacrilege. Oh my God, is that not a good drink? Now, I did a book. The other year called the Whiskey Manual. And in the Whiskey Manual, one of my friends had written a book called 101 Whiskies to Try Before You Die, which always sounded a bit of a threat to me, like he was going to kill me if I'd finished the book or finished all the whiskies. So I tasted 102 just to annoy him. But what I'd realized over the years is that you can split whiskey books into kind of three. There are books about history, great books about history. There are books about production, great books about production. There are books about tasting, great books about tasting. But especially with the tasting books, it tells you what the character is. You know, so here's Altmore, blah, 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 blah. But then it stops, move on, stops, move on. Next distillery, next distillery, next distillery. This is what it tastes like. That's not very good to try and get people interested in the versatility of whiskey. Because when you stop there, you kind of go, well, how do I enjoy it? Do I just drink it on its own? And it might be a bit too strong for people. And they might not want to drink cask strength whiskey. They might not even know that they can actually add stuff. They can add water, they can add ice, they can add mixers, they can lengthen it. So what I did with the Whiskey Manual was taste every whiskey in the book, 102 whiskies, 5 different ways. Soda water, ginger ale, cola, green tea, sweetened green tea. That's the biggest mixer in Asia. And coconut water, which is chilled coconut water. Not warm coconut water, it ends up tasting like miso soup. But chilled coconut water, it's a really good mixer as well. It's big in South America. I got to Islay and worked my way all around Islay. I thought, oh God, no, they just don't work with cola. It just doesn't work with cola. Soda, brilliant. Cola, no. And the very last whiskey, Lagavulin, it's never going to work. But I've got to do it, you know, boom. And my God, does it not work? I think it's a delicious drink. Because the smoke is there, but you get that kind of cherry character coming through. It works really well with cherry coke as well. That kind of cherry character. It mellows it down. It's like, to be honest, it's like a really, really cheap Manhattan, you know, in some ways, you know, because you do get some of that kind of red fruit, almost like kind of bitterness coming through from it. And it's just a great mix. It's called the Smoky Cookie. And I've done this drink in classes for a number of years now, and it has ended up almost in fights at times. You know, people kind of go, "How dare you? How dare you do it? It's wrong." I thought, well, I'm not saying that you have to do it. I'm saying try it. I'm not trying to impose new rules on Scotch. What I'm saying is, I think this works. If it works for you, here's a possibility. If it doesn't work for you, you don't have to do it. But one of the reasons that Scotch has been so tight, you know, why it's found it quite difficult to get new drinkers in, is because of all these rules, because of this, you can't do this and you can't do that, rather than you can do this. So it's a possibility for Scotch, and it's a possibility for a drink such as Lagavulin. And I think it works. It works so well, and you know, and a few people agree with me. You know, in Glasgow, there are pubs in Glasgow which have this on draft, which is just a wonderful thing to see. So I'm most intrigued as to what you thought of this mix.
Good, fine.
You see, it was going so well, and I blew it at the last hurdle, you know. There we go. He fell in the home straight. But you see, but that's the point about Scotch whisky, you know. I think there's an important element to take away from this, is that, you know, all of these whiskies you can try in whatever way you want. You can try them with water, you can try them with ice, you can try them mixed, you can try them in a cocktail. There is a world of flavor, there's a world of variety within Scotch whisky. You know, for me, much as I love bourbon, I'm a huge fan of bourbon. I think that the breadth of flavor that you get in Scotch whisky is greater. So you've got everything from very, very light and fragrant floral at one end to big and heavy and smoky at the other, and all points in between. So there's a huge number of ways that you can get into Scotch whisky and enjoy it. Huge numbers of ways and times of the day that you can enjoy it, temperatures you can enjoy it at, mixes you can try if you want to. The whole point about 21st century whiskey, we are living in the most exciting era of whiskey's history, and I mean global whiskey. There's never been so many distilleries in the world making whiskey as there are now. It's a glory time for us. And the whole point about this is that those barriers of self-imposed rules, I don't mean regulations, I mean self-imposed rules, are beginning to break down, because whiskey is there to be enjoyed. Whiskey is there to bring people together. Whiskey is there to put a smile on your face, or to stimulate debate, or to help a conversation ease its way in a responsible fashion through the day. So hopefully, over the past hour or so, there's been a few little nuggets within the world of Scotch whisky that you might want to absorb into your already fantastic whisky experience. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Can you hear us at all, Dave?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I think you have about 30 new girlfriends. And possibly a couple boyfriends. I can't. We do have some men in the room. So I'm amazed at what you taught us today, and thank you so much. This was really wonderful, and I've been to Scotland. It has my heart. I had to leave before I became loose-moraled woman. Because I don't know what's going on in Scotland, but it's like all the testosterone from England moved up to Scotland.
No, yeah, we've got all. It's because we wear kilts, you know.
It is very alluring, very much so. So thank you so much, Dave. Anybody have any quick questions for Dave? No, I guess we're out of time. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say that.
Yeah, fingers crossed. We might, if possible, do a Q&A, a separate Q&A session at some point in the future. But,
yeah,
because I'd love to. Because you know, the whole point of doing these things is actually, you know, opening up debate. So I'd be more than happy to.
Thank you, Dave, very much.
That's all.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Good night.